In the shadow of international isolation, nations often find themselves forced to reimagine the very foundations of their survival. For Iran, a country sitting atop some of the world's most valuable energy reserves, the weight of Western sanctions has become more than just an economic burden. It's an existential challenge that demands radical solutions. Recent developments suggest that Tehran may have found an unexpected path forward, one that winds through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth and relies on the cooperation of two nations that couldn't be more different: the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan and the People's Republic of China. This past November, a delegation from Afghanistan's Taliban Railway Bureau made a quiet but significant journey to Iran. The purpose of their visit was ostensibly straightforward: to discuss the expansion of an existing railway line connecting the two countries. But beneath the surface of this technical discussion lay something far more ambitious: a proposal that could fundamentally reshape trade corridors across Central Asia and potentially offer Iran a lifeline out of its economic isolation. The railway in question, known as the Kawaf-Herat line, currently serves as a modest connection between eastern Iran and western Afghanistan. But what the Afghan delegation proposed wasn't just an extension of this existing infrastructure. Instead, they presented a vision that would see this railway stretched eastward, crossing through one of the planet's most challenging geographical bottlenecks, the Wakhan corridor, before ultimately reaching the borders of China. For Iranian officials, this proposal represented something they've been desperately seeking for years: a secure overland route to their largest trading partner, one that wouldn't be vulnerable to the naval blockades, port seizures, and shipping interdictions that have plagued their maritime commerce. Tehran has now publicly stated its intention to work alongside the Taliban government, informally requesting that China open its borders to this ambitious infrastructure project. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. This isn't the first time such a proposal has been floated. In fact, the Taliban government has been pushing China to develop the Wakhan corridor for years, and each time, Beijing has declined. So what makes this moment different? Why is Iran now throwing its weight behind this plan? And more importantly, does their involvement change the calculus enough to convince China to finally say yes? Before we can answer these questions, we need to understand what's really at stake here, not just for Iran, but for the entire region. We need to examine why a country blessed with such enormous natural wealth finds itself in such a precarious position, and why a narrow strip of mountainous terrain along the Afghan-Chinese border has become the focal point of such intense diplomatic attention. Iran's resource paradox: wealth that cannot be spent. To understand Iran's current predicament, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of the natural resources at its disposal. This is a nation that quite literally sits on an ocean of energy. According to the most recent geological surveys and energy assessments, Iran holds proven oil reserves exceeding 220 billion barrels. To put that figure in perspective, that's enough to supply the entire world's current oil consumption for roughly 6 years. This massive reserve places Iran fourth globally, trailing only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Canada in terms of conventional crude oil deposits. But oil is only part of the story. When it comes to natural gas, the fuel that increasingly powers global electricity generation and heating, Iran's position is even more dominant. The country possesses proven natural gas reserves of approximately 34 trillion cubic meters, representing a staggering 18.2% of all known gas reserves on the planet. Only Russia surpasses Iran in this category, and these figures only account for what's already been confirmed. Beneath Iran's territory lie vast expanses of unexplored and undeveloped hydrocarbon deposits. Energy experts estimate that roughly 39.6 billion barrels of additional oil reserves remain hidden beneath the country's land masses, with another 13.4 billion barrels sitting beneath its territorial waters in the Persian Gulf and Caspian Sea. For natural gas, the untapped potential is even more dramatic. approximately 176 trillion cubic feet onshore and 138 trillion cubic feet offshore. Given this extraordinary endowment, you might reasonably expect Iran to be one of the wealthiest and most economically stable nations in the world. Energy exports have, after all, transformed countries like Norway, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates into some of the highest per capita income societies on Earth. For Iran, oil and natural gas exports represent nearly half of all foreign currency earnings, the economic foundation upon which the entire national budget rests. Yet instead of prosperity, these resources have become a source of profound frustration for ordinary Iranians. The reason is brutally simple. Possessing wealth means nothing if you cannot access markets to sell it. For decades, Iran has found itself targeted by wave after wave of international sanctions, primarily led by the United States and its European allies. These sanctions have been particularly severe in the petroleum sector, which forms the backbone of Iran's economy. Western governments have systematically blacklisted Iranian oil companies and designated hundreds of tankers in Iran's shipping fleet as sanctioned entities. Iranian financial institutions have been cut off from the SWIFT banking system and barred from conducting transactions in US dollars. American companies and citizens are prohibited from engaging in virtually any form of commercial activity with Iranian counterparts. The cumulative effect of these restrictions has been to create an economic stranglehold. Iran finds itself in the absurd position of having tremendous wealth in the ground while struggling to convert that wealth into the foreign exchange needed to import essential goods, develop infrastructure, or invest in economic diversification. Faced with this reality, Tehran had no choice but to fundamentally reorient its economic strategy. The policy that emerged from this necessity became known as the Look East approach, a deliberate pivot away from Western markets and toward deeper engagement with Asian economies, particularly China. The China Lifeline, a partnership born of necessity. Over the past 15 years, as Western sanctions tightened, Iran and China have steadily deepened their economic relationship. For Beijing, Iran represented an opportunity to secure long-term energy supplies at favorable prices from a seller with limited alternatives. For Tehran, China offered something even more valuable, a major economy willing to defy Western pressure and continue purchasing Iranian oil. This partnership reached a significant milestone in 2022 when the two nations formalized a comprehensive 25-year cooperation agreement. The terms of this deal are striking in their scope and ambition. According to the agreement, China committed to investing $400 billion in Iran over the next quarter century, covering everything from infrastructure development to telecommunications to energy sector modernization. In exchange, Iran agreed to supply crude oil to China at prices discounted between 12 and 20% below prevailing international market rates. For a country desperate for reliable revenue streams, accepting such a discount was a price worth paying for the certainty of consistent demand. This agreement essentially locked in China as Iran's primary energy customer for the foreseeable future. For Iranian policymakers, it represented a partial solution to the sanctions dilemma, a guaranteed buyer that could provide the economic oxygen Tehran needed to keep functioning. But as Iranian officials quickly discovered, having a willing buyer and actually getting your product to them safely are two very different challenges. The overwhelming majority of Iranian oil exports to China currently travel by sea, following maritime routes from Persian Gulf, loading terminals through the Strait of Hormuz across the Indian Ocean, and past the Straits of Malacca before reaching Chinese ports. It's a journey covering thousands of nautical miles through some of the world's most strategically contested waters. And it's precisely this dependence on maritime shipping that exposes Iran's energy trade to ongoing vulnerabilities. The geopolitical tensions that define the Middle East, combined with Western naval dominance and the United States' willingness to enforce sanctions through maritime interdiction, mean that every tanker leaving Iranian waters faces potential seizure, redirection, or detention. An incident from late 2023 illustrates just how real this threat is. A Greek-flagged tanker had loaded approximately 1 million barrels of Iranian crude oil and begun its voyage toward China. The ship successfully navigated the initial legs of its journey and arrived at Singapore, a major global shipping hub used for refueling and crew changes. But when the vessel docked in Singapore, it came under intense pressure from U.S. authorities. Rather than continuing to its intended destination in China, the tanker's route was forcibly altered. The ship, along with its entire cargo of nearly 1 million barrels of oil, was diverted directly to the United States, where both the vessel and its petroleum cargo were confiscated under American sanctions enforcement laws. For both Iran and China, this incident served as a stark reminder of the fragility of their trade relationship. Despite having a contractual agreement and willing parties on both sides, the actual delivery of goods remained subject to interference by third parties capable of exercising control over strategic maritime choke points and global shipping networks. This vulnerability prompted officials in both Tehran and Beijing to reach an uncomfortable conclusion. As long as their energy trade relied exclusively on sea routes, it would remain hostage to Western interdiction. What both countries desperately needed was an alternative, a secure overland transportation corridor that couldn't be blocked by naval forces or subjected to port-level seizures. The problem was finding such a route. Iran and China don't share a border, and the territory between them includes some of the most politically unstable and geographically challenging regions on Earth. For years, this seemed like an unsolvable puzzle. But then, in a development that caught many observers by surprise, Afghanistan's Taliban government stepped forward with a proposal that suddenly made the impossible seem potentially achievable. When the Taliban delegation arrived in Tehran this November, they came with more than just pleasantries and diplomatic formalities. They brought a concrete proposal centered on a seemingly modest piece of infrastructure: the Kawaf-Herat Railway. This railway line, stretching 225 kilometers from the Iranian border city of Kawaf to the Afghan city of Herat, has a history that stretches back more than 2 decades. The project was first agreed upon in 2003, when Iran committed to financing and supporting the construction of this cross-border rail link. But Afghanistan's descent into prolonged conflict, combined with the technical and logistical challenges of building in a war zone, meant that construction proceeded in fits and starts. It took nearly 2 decades for the project to finally reach completion, with the line becoming fully operational only in 2023. During those intervening years, the Kawaf-Herat Railway was envisioned as just one segment of a much larger network, the so-called 5-country railway corridor. This broader plan, actively promoted by China, would have seen the railway extended beyond Herat, crossing northeast through Afghan territory before entering Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, eventually connecting with Chinese rail networks through Central Asia. On paper, it represented an elegant solution for linking Iranian, Afghan, Central Asian, and Chinese infrastructure into a unified system. But reality proved more complicated than the planners anticipated. Beyond the security challenges posed by Afghanistan's unstable political situation, the project faced a fundamental technical incompatibility. Most of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, including Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, inherited railroad systems built to Russian gauge standards, meaning their tracks are spaced 1,520 millimeters apart. The Kawaf-Herat Railway, by contrast, was built to international gauge standards, the 1,435 millimeter spacing that's standard in China, most of Europe, and much of the world. This seemingly minor 85 millimeter difference creates enormous complications. Trains cannot simply roll from one gauge system to another. Cargo must be transferred, rail cars must be physically lifted and set on different wheel assemblies, or expensive variable gauge technologies must be employed. Each transfer point adds time, cost, and complexity. More problematically, Coordinating such a system across 5 different countries, each with its own political interests, regulatory frameworks, and economic priorities, proved to be a diplomatic nightmare. The 5 country railway corridor, despite years of planning and significant investment in its initial segment, remained stubbornly stalled at the Afghan Central Asian border. It was against this backdrop of frustrated ambition that Taliban officials proposed something different. Rather than continuing to struggle with the complications of routing through Central Asia, why not abandon that approach entirely? Instead, they suggested, extend the Kawaf-Herat Railway directly eastward, threading it through Afghan territory until it reaches the one place where Afghanistan actually shares a border with China, the Wakhan corridor. From an engineering and diplomatic standpoint, this revised approach offered several advantages. It would eliminate the problematic gauge change issues since the entire route could be built to consistent international standards. It would reduce the number of countries involved from 5 to just 3, Iran, Afghanistan, and China, dramatically simplifying the coordination challenges. And most importantly, from Iran's perspective, it would create a direct, overland connection to their largest trading partner without having to rely on potentially unstable Central Asian transit states. For Afghanistan's Taliban government, this proposal represented more than just an alternative technical solution. It offered a potential economic lifeline. To understand why the Taliban government has invested so much diplomatic energy into this railway proposal, you need to appreciate just how economically desperate Afghanistan has become. The country that American and NATO forces left behind in 2021 was already one of the poorest nations on earth. The Taliban's return to power only accelerated Afghanistan's economic isolation. International aid, which had previously accounted for nearly 3/4 of Afghan government spending, evaporated almost overnight. Foreign assets held by the Afghan Central Bank, totaling roughly $9 billion, were frozen by the United States. Most international financial institutions severed their relationships with Afghan banks. The educated professional class began an exodus that drained the country of much of its technical and administrative talent. In the face of this economic catastrophe, Taliban officials have become fixated on the Wakhan corridor as a potential salvation. This narrow strip of territory, squeezed between the Pamir Plateau to the north and the Hindu Kush Mountains to the south, represents Afghanistan's sole land border with China, a frontier approximately 92.45 kilometers in length. Earlier this year, in January, the Taliban government made a very public announcement intended to signal their seriousness about opening this corridor. They declared that they had completed construction of a 50-kilometer highway through the Little Pamir region, pushing their road infrastructure right up to the Chinese border. This wasn't just symbolic. It represented a genuine infrastructure investment in one of the most remote and challenging regions of the country. Taliban officials have been remarkably candid about their expectations for what opening the Wakhan corridor could mean for Afghanistan's economy. In statements to various media outlets, government representatives have predicted that successful activation of this border crossing could boost Afghanistan's economic growth rate by as much as 50%, a figure that, if achieved, would be absolutely transformative for one of the world's poorest nations. Now, with Iran expressing interest in connecting to this same corridor, the potential benefits for Afghanistan multiply. Instead of just serving as a border crossing for Afghan-Chinese trade, the Wakhan corridor could become a critical transit route for Iranian energy exports and other goods flowing between the Persian Gulf region and China. The transit fees, employment, and economic activity generated by such traffic could provide the Taliban government with desperately needed revenue and a degree of economic legitimacy. For their part, Iranian officials recognized the strategic value of this Afghan proposal almost immediately. Tehran quickly announced its support for convening trilateral talks among Iran, Afghanistan, and China to formally advance the railway project. Afghan representatives, eager to keep momentum building, declared they were prepared to take all necessary steps to facilitate three-way rail cooperation. If Iran and Afghanistan can present a united front and formally request Chinese participation, the diplomatic pressure on Beijing to at least seriously consider the proposal would increase significantly. Both Tehran and the Taliban government clearly hope that a coordinated approach will succeed where Afghanistan's solo efforts have repeatedly failed. But there's a reason why China has consistently rebuffed previous Afghan requests to open the Wakhan corridor. And those reasons haven't disappeared simply because Iran has now added its voice to the chorus. For Chinese policymakers, the Wakhan corridor proposal has always represented a calculation between potential economic benefits and significant strategic risks. And so far, the risks have consistently outweighed the potential rewards. The first obstacle is purely geographical. The Wakhan corridor isn't just remote. It's one of the most inhospitable places on Earth for human activity, let alone large-scale infrastructure development. Situated in the Pamir Plateau region, much of the corridor sits at elevations exceeding 4,200 meters, roughly 13,800 feet. At these altitudes, the air is thin, temperatures are extreme, and weather conditions can shift with brutal speed. For most of the year, the mountain passes that define this region are buried under heavy snow and simply impassable. Only during the brief summer months, roughly 3 months out of the year, does the corridor become even theoretically accessible for overland transit. The permanent human population of the entire Wakhan corridor is estimated at fewer than 10,000 people, almost all of them nomadic herders practicing subsistence pastoralism. There are no cities, no developed towns, barely any permanent settlements at all. It is, in the most literal sense, a frontier region that has resisted human development for thousands of years. The harsh environment extends beyond just cold and altitude. Much of the corridor passes through arid, desert-like terrain with minimal water sources and virtually no arable land. During the limited rainy season, flash floods roar through the narrow valleys, carrying enormous quantities of rock and sediment that can destroy roads and wash away bridges within hours. For engineers attempting to build railway infrastructure in such conditions, every aspect of construction becomes exponentially more difficult and expensive. Materials and equipment must be transported over vast distances to reach the construction site. Work can only proceed during the narrow summer window when weather permits. Maintaining completed sections against the ravages of winter storms, spring floods, and persistent rock slides would require ongoing investment far beyond what comparable infrastructure would demand in more temperate regions. These natural challenges alone would give any government pause. But for China, the environmental difficulties aren't even the primary concern. What really keeps Chinese officials awake at night is the security dimension. Throughout Central Asia, and particularly in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border regions, terrorist organizations, separatist movements, and extremist networks have maintained a persistent presence for decades. These groups operate under various names and with shifting alliances, but they collectively pose what Chinese security officials refer to as the three evil forces: terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism. For Beijing, these threats aren't abstract. China's western Xinjiang region, which borders the Wakhan corridor, has experienced periodic unrest and violence over the years. Chinese authorities have invested enormous resources into security measures aimed at preventing the infiltration of extremist networks across the frontier. The Wakhan corridor's value, from China's perspective, has traditionally been its role as a natural barrier. A mountain fortress that makes cross-border movement difficult for everyone, including potential security threats. The harsh terrain, limited access points, and small resident population make the corridor relatively easy to monitor and control precisely because so little legitimate activity occurs there. Opening the corridor to commercial traffic and infrastructure development would fundamentally alter this security equation. Roads and railways capable of carrying cargo containers can also transport weapons, fighters, and contraband. Border crossings require checkpoints staffed by officials who might be bribed or coerced. Increased economic activity brings larger numbers of people, creating more opportunities for smuggling and infiltration hidden within legitimate commerce. Even with the best security protocols, creating transportation infrastructure through the Wakhan corridor would inevitably make China's western frontier more porous and harder to defend. And this comes at a time when Afghanistan itself remains deeply unstable. The Taliban government that now rules Afghanistan may project an image of control, but significant parts of the country remain contested or influenced by other militant groups. ISIS Khorasan province, various regional warlords, and other armed factions continue to operate in different regions. The possibility of these groups using improved transportation infrastructure to extend their reach, either into China or into other Central Asian states, represents a risk that Chinese security planners take very seriously. This security concern explains why, despite repeated requests from the Taliban government over the past several years, China has maintained a consistent position. The Wakhan corridor will remain closed to large-scale commercial development.